Assalamu alaikum. According to the World Health Organization, millions of people die each year from causes directly attributable to air pollution. Today, many cities around the world are experiencing the full lockdown as a result of the pandemic coronavirus COVID-19. The streets are almost empty, no traffic, job tasks and school classes are conducted through the available online platforms. And as part of that, the Facilities and General Services Department at Qatar University started to partially close some buildings to decrease the consumption and prevent the spread of the disease. On the other hand, the Earth is experiencing a unique and completely new experience since long time ago. Welcome all to this recorded session. I hope it gives you all a better and clear idea of what is happening around us in the environment. My name is Mais Abdullah, an Environmental and Sustainability Specialist at the Facilities and General Services Department. Allow me to welcome my guest, Dr. Radwan bin Hamado, an Associate Professor in Environmental Science at the College of Science, Qatar University. Welcome, Doctor. It's our pleasure to have you today with us.
It's my pleasure, Mais. Thank you. Thank you for the invitation.
Thank you. Doctor, I guess many of us saw the published photos from space for Wuhan before and during the pandemic that showed a slight change in the air pollution. And also some online articles are talking about a high reduction in carbon dioxide level. I personally understand that the scientists are now studying and monitoring what's happening in order to be able to publish their scientific articles if there's really an impact of the situation on climate change. And that's why we're here today, to hear from you your expectation and things about the coronavirus and climate change. So I will leave the floor for you now to discuss this issue and present your information.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Mais, for the introduction and the opportunity to raise the awareness about climate change and what this COVID-19 pandemic is doing or not doing with it. I will try during the upcoming minutes to demystify some concepts about climate change and how this pandemic is affecting not only our environment or the climate change as a whole, but also shaping the policy making process worldwide. Before getting into the details of such impacts the pandemic is having on the climate system, let me take some minutes to explain what is climate change actually and how it is happening. So climate change is actually a natural process. It's a natural cycle. Climate was always changing. Indeed, Earth experienced periods of glaciation and other warmer periods during the interglacial periods. And actually fossils of alligators were found in Spitsbergen in Norway, a Norwegian archipelago in the Arctic Ocean. So what is the difference with today's climate change? The problem we are facing today is because the speed of change in the climate system is very high today. So the temperatures are increasing in a way that our Earth is not coping with the changes. So our planet is heating and heating fast, causing long-term changes to our weather. That is what we are talking about when we mention climate change, that is due to human activities. And here in this graph, we can actually see that during the Industrial Revolution, we had an increase of temperature, but that increase became very abrupt during the last decades, starting from mid of the last century. And this is being linked to extremes, such as the one that we witnessed during the last months. We all knew about the devastating fires in Australia, or the torrential rains in Indonesia or India, or in Europe during the last summer for the record-breaking temperatures, or what we call the heat waves. And this is down to us as humans. And I will try to explain a little bit better that. So indeed, from the 19th century, during the Industrial Revolution, coal, oil, and gas, known as fossil fuels, have transformed the way we live, but only later that we discovered the problems they were causing. But actually that was a little bit too late. We already had, everyone had his television, his car, his computer, his microwaves, and all the plastic that we are using in our daily lives. Mm-hmm. But the burning fossil fuels releases gases that trap the heat from the sun. That is why they are known as greenhouse gases. And we can see in this animation that actually in unmanned world, when the sunlight reaches the earth, part of it is reflected out to the space. Another part is absorbed by the land or the ocean, and another to heat the atmosphere itself, due to that famous greenhouse effect. But when we increase drastically these gases into the atmosphere, and here we can see from a normal situation to abnormal situation where we enhanced the greenhouse effect. It amplifies that effect, and the temperatures are warmed further and further. And carbon dioxide is one of the major offenders. There is now more of it in the atmosphere than there was that has been for millions of years. It's true that the amount of CO2 we are accumulating in the atmosphere, and this is very important to understand, is not the result of what we are emitting today, but it's the accumulation of in the atmosphere as a result of emissions of decades and perhaps even centuries. And issues like deforestation are making the problem even worse. So here we can see, for example, during the last just few years, how the concentration of CO2 was increasing during the years. And here we have the March 2020, and we didn't till then witness it really a drastic reduction on the concentration of CO2. What it means that how much of that CO2 was absorbed by the ocean and by the plants and by the forests didn't compare with the lockdown that we are witnessing today. Mm-hmm. So we are not still at that zero balance or zero net balance or emission for the CO2. So these emissions are usually generated by humans activities. And here, just to take an example, for the US, we have here 28% of the emissions are generated from transportation. Others are generated from electricity generation. Industry is responsible for 22%. Agriculture, commercial, and households are responsible for respectively 9%, 6%, and 5% of the emissions. So those extra emissions of CO2 or the extra concentration of CO2 that we are emitting in the atmosphere are coming from our activities. And this is causing a slight increase in the temperature, around 1.2, 1.1 in the range since the Industrial Revolution. That does not look like a huge difference. Actually, these tiny changes are already changing our planet. Take the Arctic, for example. Half of the volume of the sea ice has been lost since the 70s. And the temperature are still going up, and if nothing is done, what we call the business as usual, we will be by the end of the century, 2100, over 3 degrees centigrade more than the pre-industrial area. That means dramatic changes actually in our Earth that will not look like what we are used to see. So the sea level rise, for example, one of the impacts of the climate change, would put hundreds of millions living in the coastal zone at risk. And if we can get a small look into what will happen to Qatar, for example, coastal areas, there will be more deadly heat waves and extreme droughts also. But depending on the extreme carbon cuts, if we do our job very well as politicians and as persons and people, compared to if the business as usual, we can see that all the coastal zone of Qatar will be completely submerged by the sea. So that's something that actually we are witnessing already, the rise of the sea level. So this is caused by humans, as some skeptical would suggest. That is not. Well, what science tells us is the contrary. It says that the industrial activities that our modern civilization depends upon have raised the atmospheric carbon dioxide from what we measured at that time in 280 part per million, or ppm, 200 ppm, to 412, 415 ppm right now. And this is just in 150 years. And this is what makes the big problem. And scientists, actually 1,300 independent scientific experts from countries all over the world that forms the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or the IPCC. All these good people attribute the global warming trend observed since the mid-20s to the human expansion of the greenhouse effect. So warming the atmosphere is the result of trapping heat radiating from Earth towards the space. So these IPCC 1300 experts concluded there is a more than 95% probability that human activities over the past 50 years have warmed our planet. So it's like taking our kids to the hospital because he has extreme fever. And you see 100 doctors, and 95 of them will suggest you to take him in urgency to the intense care. And 5 will advise you to go home with him because there's nothing to worry about. What you will be doing? I will not take that risk and come back home as nothing is happening. So what we should keep in mind after this small introduction about climate change is that climate change we are witnessing today is mainly due to human activities. So these activities are emitting CO2 and other gases, what we call the GHGs, or the greenhouse gases, that are trapping the heat within the atmosphere through this greenhouse effect. This is warming our Earth and disturbing the climate system and impacting us all through mainly not that 1.2 degrees in average increase, but mainly through those extreme weather conditions. And the changes in how the environment is functioning is also indicating that there is major and global impact of climate change. So if nothing is done, business as usual, Earth will be most likely unlivable in several regions by the end of this century. Mm-hmm. So emissions should be reduced. That's our solution in order to halt the rate of the change of the climate. And then the COVID-19 appeared. So even if it's possible today for the people in India to see the Himalaya for the first time in looks like 30 years, or the people from Venice in Italy to finally see fishes in their canals, it's still impossible to quantify exactly the effect of this pandemic will have on the climate system. But still, it's somehow obvious the worldwide reduction in industrial, economic, or social activities are having on the emissions of the greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. So this is actually something humanity has already witnessed in the past, when other pandemics, like the Spanish flu, for example, or economic recession, like during the Great Depression in 1928, or the 2 oil shocks in the 70s, or more recently during the 2008 financial crash. So during all these periods, we had a drop in terms of the CO2 emissions. And we are forecasting, indeed, a reduction in the emission. But keep in mind, that means that the concentration of the CO2 in the atmosphere will be lower? We are not sure about it. So remember that we measure in the atmosphere What we measure in the atmosphere is not just what resulting from what we emitting today, but all the cumulative emissions that we are having in the last decades and perhaps even centuries. But still, during this COVID pandemic, we are witnessing a global reduction of the emissions. That is true. So these dramatic changes in the behavior through lockdown in entire countries have only resulted in what we predict being 8% reduction in emission at best. And we are up to end of April, actually, we're around 5 to 6% emission. This is what we are witnessing actually. This is the 2%, 4%, and 6%, and we are up to now around the 5 to 6% reduction. And this is mainly due to the industry lockdown. We had 25% of China industrial capacity that was locked down, or reduction in transportation related to activities where air traffic has dramatically dropped. So here, for example, hopefully it will work. Yeah. So here we can see the difference between 2019 and 2020 air traffic under European skies during one average day in April. But also road transportation was reduced. And for example, if we take here for the US, a reduction of 52% of the gasoline, or even 75% decline in jet fuels, which is related to the drop in the air traffic. So if COVID-19 leads to a drop in emission of around even 5% in 2020, let's say, then that is actually the sort of reduction we need every year until net zero emission are reached around 2050. That's the commitment we had in Paris. So even this would not come close to bringing to that 1.5 degrees centigrade increase in the temperature. Global emission will need to fall by some 7.6% every year this decade. What we are witnessing with this pandemic is just a 1 year reduction of 8%. So the next year we will need another around the same effect of this pandemic, and the year after, and the year after. And this is what was agreed in Paris. So shall we have a cumulative series of pandemics every year so this is achieved? Or shall we find humans sustainable solutions that will reduce gradually but surely the emissions every year until we reach the net zero emission? The net zero emission is that when whatever you are emitting in the atmosphere is actually also absorbed by the ocean and the plants and everything. So you are keeping constant the concentration of the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So such emissions reduction will not happen via lockdowns. Okay. I forgot to go through the slides. So we need actually policy, and that lead to a deployment of clean technology, reduction in the demand for energy, for example. But what we know also is that climate change is irreversible. What we try to do is to lower its pace. It's not to completely cancel it. And it's not a punctual lowering of emission that will halt the climate change, as is the pandemic that we are witnessing today. It should be a long-term effort. So we need really policy, systemic shift, either in the conception or in the production. So what are the expected effects of this pandemic on the climate change? So, and I will make the difference between the long versus the short-term trends. So let's start with the brighter side, with the expected effect, the positive expected effects. So besides that marginal positive effect on the short-term air or water pollution that we mentioned it everywhere in the world, we should have something quite important, that is politicians and the general public will listen more to scientists. And hopefully we understood that it will not be Ronaldo or Messi who will save your life, but the doctor or the nurse in the hospital or the scientist in his lab developing a cure or vaccine. So this increased the position and the visibility of the scientists and how the science can change the life of everyone. All these scientists also who are now more prompt to share data and global solutions to global crises. And definitely climate change is definitely the most pressing global issue that needs a global solution. So hopefully this pandemic trained scientists on how they can be working together on a common target. Hopefully also the ordinary person, me and you, learned that we can change or reduce our frenetic consumption. So that's what we call the sufficiency. And decision makers and policymakers learned also that production systems should be more efficient and that we should produce locally with our own resources. That is what we call efficiency and consistency in sustainability. And all these actually three, efficiency, sufficiency, consistency, are the pillars of sustainability. So, and all these were somehow covered by this pandemic, and we were all trained on that. So we had to, every country had to somehow experience the fact that they need to produce their own surgical masks, for example, with their own capabilities. And everyone had to decrease his consumption because we are not traveling anymore and we are not having that consumerism that we used to have. So this crisis creates an opportunity to not only invest in recovery efforts, just economic, but also the policy and the real action to what we call decarbonize our economies, such as smart grids to lower electricity bills of countries, investment in use of clean energies, and switch to a more eco-friendly ways of, for example, transportation, electric vehicles, more efficient public transportation, and so on. But unfortunately, there is a negative outcome that we are expecting from this pandemic on the climate change, is that the word focus on the pandemic has meant less attention is being paid to climate change. And we are fears that there is fears of politicians to be focused mainly on economic recovery rather than fighting climate change after the pandemic. So the negotiations, for example, on the climate change, the COP26, are actually suspended. And the politicians will have to show that their economies are recovering fast and then may ignore environmental issues and the impact that aggressive recovery may have on climate change. So definitely their elections will happen much sooner than the end of the century, unfortunately. And also, we know that the cheap oil means less investment in renewables and larger use of fossil fuels post-pandemic because it's cheap. So it's to fuel the recovery. That will mean more emissions, and more emissions will mean faster climate change. Therefore, we understand that after all, this pandemic should have an ambiguous effect on climate change. And with contrasting potential effects. But just to finish on a positive note and some hope, inshallah. So the way to go for government and people will actually depend on each one of us, on our ability to act now and in a significant way. As we know it, we are actually the first generation to witness the impact of climate change and the last generation that can do something about it. So that's really up to each one of us. Okay, Mace, then thank you for listening and hope that was not too gloomy.
Thank you, Doctor.
But definitely the momentum is not really under a positive mood, but we hopefully will have a better perspective in the near future, and at least we can focus to a happy and blessed Eid within the next some few days.
Inshallah. Thank you so much, Doctor, for this informative session. And before we end it, I just have a couple of questions. you mentioned something about measuring today's carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. That does not mean it's today's carbon dioxide. It's an accumulative one, right?
Right.
So what we are
Right.
collecting every day is as a cumulative. It's not today's carbon dioxide level in the atmosphere.
Yeah, definitely. It's like the atmosphere is like a container, actually, and you are filling it with the CO2. And you have an input and you have an output, and that output is what we have from the ocean that absorb the CO2, or the forests that absorb the CO2, uptake the CO2 for the photosynthesis for the plants. But also the ocean is having a very much big effect on the absorption of the CO2. That's the output from that container, which is the atmosphere. But the input is our emissions, but also the container has already something
remaining, yeah.
And that's what we call the turnover. So how long it will take to move away what we are accumulating in this container, and that's what we call also the residence time, is how long it will take. So for that reason, when I was mentioning it takes decades, or somehow some studies are talking about residence of around a century, then what we are witnessing is not what we are emitting today, but what we are accumulating as input and as output during the last century.
Okay, so it might take a decade in order to reach a zero or a net carbon emissions.
So the zero net emission is when our emissions, we will not be able to stop our emissions, or the input, as we said, the input of CO2 into the atmosphere. But the net zero emission is when the input are equal to the output. Okay,
it's not depending on the accumulative form, right?
Yeah, what is accumulating is there. If we reach, for example, 428 ppm, we will be at 428 until the end of the century. We will not be accumulating more and more and more and more as we are doing today. This is the business as usual, is we are putting much more than what is extracted. And for that reason, that there is that cumulative effect. What we need to reach by 2050 is that we are balancing the input and the output, and we are in that zero net emission situation. And that's what we need to reach by 2050 to get only 1.5 degrees centigrade increase in temperature compared with the industrial era.
Okay. Another question is that you mentioned that by the end of this crisis, we might have a 5 to 6 degree reduction in carbon dioxide level, right?
5 to 6% reduction of emission globally compared to 2019.
And is that a really good percentage?
That's what we should do even without pandemic.
Yeah.
So for the reason that I was mentioning, do we want to have a pandemic every year so that we reach our target? Or we should do our job and find solutions? So definitely, I think that everyone answers should be finding sustainable solutions in reducing by ourselves the emissions and not relying on a small virus to do the job for us.
Yeah, but you came with the last solution with a very important sentence, where you mentioned that the oil prices are decreased or cheap, so that people who will not who did not have the enough awareness, they will go for the cheaper options, and they will not invest in the sustainable and renewable energy. And
definitely.
Yeah, we know that this situation will not last and people will resume their daily life sooner or later. But the challenge here is to sustain a good environment after this pandemic is over.
Yeah, definitely. But let me remember everyone and us also, that we have a commitment. Okay, so definitely we will go for sheep because it's cheap. But if we know what is the impact of that sheep on the long term for our kids, then we will think about it. And for that reason that there is these agreements. So the last one is mainly in Paris, and the additional commands in Sweden. So the Paris Agreement is signed by the countries, and all the countries by 2020, by this year, needs to provide to the UNFCCC. So it's an organism that is monitoring how the countries are implementing their plans for reduction of the emissions. They need to provide to the UNFCCC their action plan on how they will be achieving the reduction of their emissions as it was stipulated in the Paris Agreement. So definitely the politicians will be tending and having that excuse of they need to recover their economy, and the social situation is bad, and we need to give money to the people, and wealth and health and so on. But in the same time, we need to put pressure that this recovery is actually an opportunity to make it a green revolution and a green recovery, so that we invest in systemic changes in the infrastructure, for example. And this is actually a good opportunity, and there is a lot of initiatives from some governments already on how to make this recovery being more eco-friendly or more green, and that will sustain the, as you mentioned it, the improvement, at least on the short term, of the environmental conditions that we are witnessing everywhere in the world.
Exactly. So our message today is not only for the ordinary people, but also for the decision makers, because they are they're very important. They have the very important role in the life.
Yeah, definitely. But everyone has his role, really.
Exactly. Yeah.
We need all to act at the same time, and we need to act in very quick. Actually, we cannot look at that scenario of having a business as usual going on and assisting to all these extreme weather conditions that are happening everywhere in the world. Just by the last century, in the 20th century, at the beginning there was around 15 weather extremes in the world. Today we are over 500. So you can see already that there is already something that is happening to the climate, and these extremes are the ones that are impacting the most our lives and our ecosystems. It's not that 1.2 degrees or 1.5 degrees centigrade that will be by the end of the century. That's an average. When we go out from our car from our home to outside, we can have even an increase of 8 degrees, and we will not be dying for that. But what we will be dying for is the heat waves, are the floodings, are the droughts, are all these losses of biodiversity and habitats that we are witnessing because of these extremes that are happening everywhere in the world.
Exactly. Thank you so much, Doctor, for this session. And at the end, I just want to thank all the people who are going to watch us and watch this session. And because we don't have today audience, we'll give them the chance to reach us through the available emails here, the addresses, as they are shown in the slide for Dr. Radwan and for our section, the Environment and Sustainability section. And yes, that's the end of our session. We hope you stay safe and healthy during this difficult time, and happy Eid to everyone.
Thank you, Mais, and happy Eid, and Eid Mubarak for you and for all the audience, virtual audience that you will have. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Doctor. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.